course of the last few weeks, we've been looking at the events of the Friday of the last week of Jesus' life. The reason that this is so worth our consideration is because we get the story of Jesus in the Gospels of mostly his ministry. Don't know much about his childhood. We learn some about his ministry, about the things that he did, but more time is devoted in those Gospels to the events of the last week than anything else. And the reason is because there is more evidence about Jesus being who he claims that he was in that last week than there was through the rest of his ministry. In other words, this becomes the proving factor that Jesus qualifies as an anchor for all of us. Everything that we have studied, Jesus experienced to the max. There is no one in this room who will ever experience more sorrow than Jesus had to deal with. Nobody. So what that means is when Dan's having a time of sorrow, he can anchor to Jesus because he's been through more than I've been through. There is no one in this room who has been examined and tested and tried and judged in the intelligence of humans more than Jesus Christ was. There is no one who has had to deal with hypocrisy and pretense to a higher degree than Jesus Christ. And Friday night proves that. There's none of us who have had to deal with the despair and the desertion of other people to the extent that Jesus Christ did. And we looked at last time that there are none of us who have ever been as unjustly treated as Jesus. I don't care what kind of court we go to, I don't care what kind of legal proceedings, none of us have ever been or will ever be as unjustly treated as was Jesus Christ. And all of that means I have hope. All of that means he offers you hope. It's amazing to me that in the garden, Jesus discovers his peace. He works through his sorrow, and God sends an angel, and Jesus gets it all put together. And from that point on, everything that happens in this night of turmoil, Jesus meets with a spirit of peace. And it's truly amazing that he could go through the unjust trial and be at peace with that. That he could be deserted by his followers and have peace regardless. John's gospel even records kind of and I use the word mysterious because I have read all kinds of explanations, but nobody knows because the book doesn't tell us. It's amazing when they approach Jesus and ask if he's the Christ, and he says he is, I am he. It says they drew back and fell to the ground. Now when we studied that, we said there could have been 600 Roman soldiers. There could have been 100, 200, 300 Jewish people involved. There could have been near to 1,000 people who asked Jesus if he's the Christ. He says, I am, and they hit the ground. I have no idea why that is. That's one of the questions I want to ask Jesus. What made those people hit the ground? Why did they all of a sudden? Was it honor? Was it terror? Was it, what was it that caused that? But it was there. All of these people recognized something about Jesus. He's at peace. And I want to suggest to you that from that point on, everybody else is in turmoil. Everybody else is really wrestling with what's happening. What led Peter to think that he could take on with his dagger the Roman soldiers? What led him to believe that would be something that he could possibly do? Maybe because he saw how everybody hit the ground when they knew it was Jesus. Maybe he thought, Jesus got some extra power here, and I'm going to help him along. Don't know. But Peter was not at rest. Peter was not at peace. It's obvious that a certain restlessness had captivated everyone in the garden except Jesus. You can feel the bewilderment of the crowd as this man that they came to arrest. Now again, just try to see how these people must have been thinking. They come to arrest Jesus. They all hit the ground. Whatever has happened has impressed everyone. They're all on the ground. They've got back up. Peter lobs off this guy's ear, and Jesus reaches down, picks up this bloody ear, and puts it back on. You know, and to kind of quote Phil this morning, about that time I'm going to be saying, I'm on his side. You know, I'm with him. Don't you know that made confusion? We're supposed to be arresting this guy. Look, I just saw him put that ear back on. Restlessness. If you had been a witness of that event, what would have been going through your mind? What questions? Who is this guy? What are we doing here? The disciples, even though they have witnessed the peace of Jesus, are anything but at peace themselves. I think they're like caged horses that are just eagerly awaiting to gallop away from this corral of confusion. You know, what's going on? Are we in danger? They're just chomping at the bit to run, and they get the opportunity, and apparently they do. The calm Jesus is then taken to the house of the high priest Annas, and there, as we discussed last week, the illegal proceedings begin against Christ. There were no charges that were brought, but Jesus remains calm and collected. The high priest gets upset and frustrated. There's tension to the point that one of his accessory people strikes Jesus for talking that way to the high priest. Now, Jesus gets led away. But there is such a contrast here. Every action of Christ comes from inner peace. Every word he speaks is peaceful. All the other players are disjointed, they're disconnected, there is disorder. And that scene is going to continue as we go to the house of Caiaphas. Now, I just want to mention, because I'm going to go a totally different direction, all the illegalness of this Jewish trial continue. So everything we talked about last time, it's continuing on. Everything happens in Caiaphas' palace is just as irresponsible to legal justice of Judaism as it was in the beginning. But I've already talked about that, so we're not going to go that way. But just know that all of that is still continuing. It's not public. It's at night. There's no crime. There are no witnesses. There are no charges that have been brought. They're trying to get Jesus to tell them what charge they can bring against him. And all of that stands against Jewish protocol. What I want to suggest now, though, is that Jesus is going to get tried by prejudice. He's going to get tried by prejudice. And let me just set this up a little before we begin to look at the three different examples that there are. Chris led us in a class a few weeks ago about the subject of prejudice, and we talked a lot about different aspects of this. But I'm approaching it today from the standpoint that our prejudices cause us to do things like hold beliefs that are unsubstantiated by facts. But what is even perhaps worse than that is we will find that the prejudice that is exhibited in this mock trial of Christ not only is ignorant of facts, it has no desire to have any information. What will become evident as we watch this whole thing unfold is how the group, the individuals, these people have no desire whatsoever to learn, to hear, to comprehend, to challenge their thoughts. There's no interest in justice. There is only pre-justice. And so all they are attempting to do is to justify their preconceived notions, what they believe. They're not open to evaluating what they believe. They're just out to prove what they believe is true. And the lengths they go to are phenomenal. Jesus is now going to face the trial of human prejudice. Every mind in the house is already made up. Preconceptions about Jesus, his claims, and his death have left no thirst for honest information or spirit seeking further understanding. Nobody wants any of that. It's just totally gone. And I'm not talking about one or two people who have already made up their minds. I'm talking about everybody in the room. There is no one willing to even hear what Jesus has to say. Imagine that, folks. Jesus' trial by prejudice is greater than any human being has ever experienced. Ever. Let's read about it. Matthew chapter 26. And those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter also was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and he entered in, sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus in order that they might put him to death. And they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you make no answer? What is it these men have are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes, saying, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered and said, "He is deserving of death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you?" Let's consider, first of all, the prejudice that existed here in finding false witnesses, in obtaining false witnesses. Scripture reveals that the Jewish leadership was actually seeking false testimony. Now remember, as we look through the legal practices, the judiciary practices of the Jews, if you were a false witness, you got the punishment that you were trying to give to the one that you were lying about. But now, the leadership, rather than protecting the one being attacked, the one needing defense, now they actually are in charge of seeking to develop false witnesses. People that they could find knowing that they would lie. But the problem was, they were going to keep the part of the law that said you had to have 2 or 3 of them. So trying to find 2 or 3 people that have the same lie is difficult, even to this day. They were looking for someone who had an untrue statement. The same Greek word appears in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 15 when Paul said, "If we preach that Christ is raised and he has not been raised, then we give false witness against God that he raised Jesus if he didn't raise Jesus and we preach that he did." Same word. The Jews are seeking someone who will give a false word, someone who will make up a testimony. The Scripture says they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. I don't know what mental vision you get of this. We've got Jewish leaders and anybody got a story you can make up about this guy? And, you go meet with them, see what they say. They're just running through these people, looking for someone who can make a false testimony. Mark's account adds this to it. Many were giving false testimony against him. I suspect, there was reward, there was benefit to being the one that would cause the death of Christ. And so if they're looking for false witnesses, there were people that were willing to do that. But it says, and yet none of their testimony was consistent. Interesting. Looking for a false witness and you can't find consistent false witness. You can't find a consistent liar. You can feel the frustration as the council attempts to find plurality of false witnesses. There is no consistency among liars. And imagine that. There still isn't. Finally, 2 make a similar accusation. They say something they report something that Jesus said. Now, they don't report it correctly, but here's what they testify to. We heard Jesus say that this man has stated, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." Mark's account says some stood up and began to give false testimony, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" And not even that was consistent, Mark says. What Jesus actually had said was this: "What sign do you show us?" the Jews asked, "seeing that you do these things?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews therefore said, "It took 46 years to build this temple. How will you raise it up in 3 days?" What was Jesus talking about? Destroy this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days. It was the Jews who made it an issue about the physical temple. Twisted words of Jesus are raised as the inconsistent accusation against him by lying witnesses. How is Jesus going to handle these accusations? He's being misquoted, he's being misrepresented, he's being lied about, and now here is the council about ready to pass judgment on things that they have been misinformed about. What is Jesus going to do? Is it now time to justify himself? Should he say who he really is, what's really been going on? Here's what Scripture says, "And the chief priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, 'Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But he kept silent and made no answer." Jesus did not respond. How can you respond to false testimony about you? You know, it's like the hypothetical question, "Maurice, have you stopped beating your wife?" How are you going to answer that? Is he going to say no? Well, then what's that mean? If he says yes, what does that mean? That's where Jesus was at. He's got these false testimony that has been raised up against him. How is he supposed to respond? He makes no answer. He makes no answer. Now, again, we feel this great frustration. The crowd has listened to a pile of false witnesses until they came up with a couple who could make some inconsistent accusations. And it's the best that they have, so they're going with it. But Jesus is not even willing to address their accusations. Literally, it says that Jesus answered not one word. He did not answer one word. King James is pretty neat the way it renders it. Jesus kept his peace. And you can read that two ways. He held his peace. He kept his peace by not answering a word. That may be, by the way, some good information for us to file away sometime when we think we are enduring that same kind of prejudice. So we have this first example of the prejudice toward Jesus. And then I want to get more specific about the prejudice exemplified by Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, we've already described that he has sold his soul, if you will, politically to Rome to keep things at peace. He is connected with all of the overcharging in the temple, and that's going into his pocket. You know, he's everything that a crooked politician would be. An immense amount of prejudice that he exhibits this night. And the high priest stood up and came toward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent. He made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." In these verses, can you just see Caiaphas growing frustrated? You know, the plan is we were going to get rid of Jesus. We were going to wait till after the Passover was done, till the feast was over. But Judas came up and he said, "You know what? I'll turn him over to you." "Oh, good. We can get it done beforehand then." And so, you know, he's got this plan. He's got this vision. This is how it's all going to happen. And now here's Jesus. We've given false testimony, and we're going to catch him. We're going to trip him with this. But Jesus just is silent. He doesn't respond. And Caiaphas is growing more and more frustrated with this thing. And so what actually Caiaphas does is he looks at this silence of Jesus, and he's got to know this is not the silence of guilt. This is the silence of innocence. This is a silence of dignity. This is a silence of majesty and integrity. This is a silence of trust. It was a deafening silence, and it was all ringing in the ears, if you will, of Caiaphas. And in chapter 26, verse 63, the Greek word there means that Jesus was continuing silent, which the implication is that he was pestered over and over and over to give testimony about himself. It wasn't just that he was asked, how are you going to answer these? And he remained silent. He was asked, and he was asked again, and he was asked again, and somebody else asked, and somebody else asked, and Jesus just kept being silent. He was cornered. People were trying to attack him, and he's silent, and he's silent. And finally, this all is going nowhere. So Caiaphas makes his way towards Jesus. That's what Matthew said. He walks towards Christ. And he says, you're not going to make an answer? Then he says, I'm going to challenge you. Before God, I'm going to call you to an oath before deity, knowing Jesus will have to answer such a challenge before God. Tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. He wants Jesus to make that claim. He's challenged him to make that claim. He also knows, as soon as he does, he can make the accusation that Jesus has claimed to be equal with deity, and that's blasphemy. He knows that. But is Jesus God? Is Jesus truth? So he's called to make a solemn vow before God. And he answers that he is. Leviticus chapter 26 is the old law where if you blaspheme the name of God, that you were to be put to death. So now Jesus speaks. And his answer is, you have said it yourself. It is as you have said. Are you the Son of God? I agree with you, I am. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. What's that about, Jesus? He knows what they're going to do with his statement that he's the Christ. And he wants them to know, you stand here and judge me today in your prejudice, but know this, you're going to see me come in the clouds, and I'm going to judge with justice. And Jesus said, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? Jesus' answer was not blasphemy because he was God. But it was the answer that Caiaphas needed to make his bigotry and his preconception about Jesus justified. And so, there is this strange irony that he tears his robe upon hearing that Jesus claims to be God's Son. Interesting that we read in the Old Testament often about people renting their garments, tearing their clothes. But for the high priest to do that, though, he could not do that for himself. In other words, it couldn't be personal sorrow that led him to tear his clothes. It had to be a sorrow that was based upon God. In other words, God being dishonored, God being harmed. And then the high priest could tear his garment. And that undoubtedly, is Caiaphas' justification for doing what he is doing. This is Caiaphas trying to force his prejudice. Look what he said! What more do we need? We don't need any... He says we don't need any witnesses. He should have said, we don't need any more false witnesses. And the group responds, and they say, he deserves death. Lastly, the prejudice of the crowd, the whole crowd. What do you think? They said he deserves death, and they began to spit on his face and to beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. And they said, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that has hit you? No charges, no evidence, no crime, no proof that Jesus is not the Son of God, just a room full of prejudiced people. And now they begin to allow the prejudice to take full control in such a way. The high priest has rent his garments. You have heard it. They say he deserves death. The bias of the bullies has found the means for an unjust judgment. Mark's account says, and they all condemned him to be deserving of death. A unanimous call. Everyone was functioning with the same amount of prejudice. Take him out. This is truly unbelievable. This is the Jewish Supreme Court. This is supposed to be the epitome of defending the innocent. And they are now crucifying Jesus. Luke adds this. They were saying many other things against him. Blaspheming. Isn't that the way it works? When we're caught up in prejudice, we're not interested in learning, we're not interested in gaining new information, we're just interested in following our preconceived perceptions. And here are these people, they are actually blaspheming themselves while they're saying, kill Jesus because he has. Now, folks, that's the way the devil wants you to work too. It's the way he wants me to work. He wants us to get so prejudiced about other people, what they've done, haven't done, spiritually, that we want to condemn. The whole while we may be doing the same thing. And that's the message Paul wrote to the Jews in Romans chapter 2. How is it you condemn when you're doing the same thing? That's how we glorify Satan, though. And that's what was happening this night. The group, they spat upon Christ. Numbers 12, Deuteronomy 5 show that was one of the greatest disdains in all of Jewish history, was to spit upon someone. As a matter of fact, sidebar, I read this, and I was going to check with somebody who had been there, but I haven't. Supposedly, outside the city of Jerusalem, there is identified what's called Absalom's tomb. And my understanding was that for centuries, if not into even modern day times, that's my question, I don't know, every Orthodox Jew who walked by Absalom's tomb, what was identified as Absalom's tomb, they spat on it. Because that's the highest level of disdain among the Jewish nation. And so the rebellious son against David, they spat upon him. They covered up his head. They're using Jesus as a punching bag. Remember those little blow-up punching bags? Bozo the clown or whatever he was. Here's Jesus. They put this bag over his head and they start punching at him. Prophesy. Who's smacking you, Jesus? And there were some who were apparently a little more giving, and they wouldn't make a fist. They chose to slap him instead. They're turning Jesus into this punching bag. Tell us who it is who's hitting you. And when the Sanhedrin grew tired of this, when they had played this all out as much as they wanted to, they said, okay, you temple guards, you can take over now, and you can have the same fun we are. And they continued the same thing against Jesus. Let me end with some observations. There are those today who are just as prejudiced against Jesus Christ. Their minds are made up, and their response to Jesus will never be adjusted by the truth of the living Son of God. They are convinced. They don't want the information. They don't want the facts. Those people may be atheists, but they may not be. They just don't want to hear about Jesus. Just don't want to hear about what Jesus wants of their life. But from Jesus' statement to a room full of spiritual bigots, know this, that anyone who judges Jesus with such contempt and with such preconceived prejudices will one day stand before Jesus Christ, who will not be about getting even. He will be about complete, honest justice. And if you have not named the name of Christ, He will not name yours. If you have never allowed His truth to penetrate your life, His truth cannot justify your life. Jesus will be 100% just, not prejudice. His judgment will be pure and right. You know, when I think of this scene, Typically, we think of the crucifixion, and as events get closer to the crucifixion, we think of how that moves us. But as I think about this scene and the prejudices against Jesus, it's like that should be me. Those people should be saying that stuff about Dan. Because Dan is those things. But Jesus was not. And so Jesus' Jewish trial, it should have been mine. I'm the one who deserved the sentence. He did not. I could have been justly executed. He was unjustly. God should have spit in my face and turned me into a punching bag. That's what should have happened. But God's grace says, I can escape that because Jesus, the one who was good, became guilty so that the one who was really guilty could become good. His sacrifice was not for the righteous, but for the repentant. So don't leave here today with ungrounded prejudice and resistance towards the one who offered no resistance just for you. Everything we've read about the events in the house of Caiaphas should have happened to you. But Jesus stepped in and said, I'll take their place. And so innocently, he went to the cross so that you and I could be cleansed by his blood. Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power?